following week, we're going to be off, the 9th of October, and then the following week, we're going to start with the Gospels. Kind of detailed look at the Gospels. I think I have that right. Or is it the Torah?
No, I don't know. I didn't.
It's one of those two.
Torah is supposed to start on the 16th.
Okay, thank you. It won't be the Gospel, it will be the Torah. So this is kind of preliminary to when we do the Gospels, and then next week will be preliminary to when we do the Torah. And there'll be a week off in between.
When is the guest coming?
The guest is coming on the 23rd, and he is he's a professor in a church in Denmark, has his doctorate from Oxford, and he's going to talk about his doctoral thesis is on re-understanding the terms used that other people use for homosexuality in the Old Testament. So it will be, I'm expecting him to be really, really good.
How do you know this?
He emailed me, and he knows me from Pele.
Oh.
Knows me by reputation, and therefore,
Okay.
I said,
Well, you saw Pele when you were on sabbatical, right?
in a week with Pele. All right, so just a little reminder of a couple things we've already done. The first is that we talked about reading the Bible in terms of hearing God's judgment and promise, reading it for yourself, not to use it against someone else. We talked about reading it in context. And most of the last 2 weeks have been trying to create what that context is. And then we spent some time looking at some Bible passages to see where they all, where you can see places where there's the same story told by a different voice, and sometimes they're put together. And we looked at both Hebrew Scriptures and New Testament, and we also looked at some dates. And to just review some of those dates, one was 586. One was 1000 of the BCE. 1000 was the ascension of David to be a king of united Israel and Judah. The next was about 830, which was the division between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, in which the northern kingdom was everything outside of Judah and Benjamin and had a different capital. The capital was Samaria. And then the southern kingdom, or Judah, had its capital in Jerusalem. In the southern kingdom, there were Davidic kings that ruled. In the northern kingdom, there were really no dynasties of any long life. Usually, when you wanted to get rid of a king, often you'd have a king and his son, one of his sons. Then you'd have a revolt, and another military figure would become king in the north. And then in 722, which I talked about anyway, the destruction of the northern kingdom by the Assyrian army and the lost 10 tribes. And then in 586, the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonian military and the exile. And then we talked about the exile being the time when a lot of what we now call the Hebrew Scriptures were put together so that you could hold a community together when they didn't have a temple anymore, or a priest anymore, or a king anymore, or a city anymore. And then we talked about the other big destruction of Jerusalem. We didn't do a lot about the history between 586 and 70. I'll get a little bit of that tonight. But in 70 is the destruction of Jerusalem again by the Romans. Here's an interesting factoid. The Jewish community commemorates the destruction of both the first temple by the Babylonians and the second temple by the Romans on the same day, because historically they happened by some weird thing. They happened on the same day.
That's strange.
The date on the Jewish calendar is Tish B'Av. It's the day of mourning. On our calendar, it's either the 29th or 30th of July. And it turns out that the Babylonians and the Romans 636 years apart, destroy the temple on exactly the same day. Wow. Two different temples, one built by Solomon, the one that the Romans destroyed was built by Herod. I'll say something about the one in between, even though the one built by Herod is called the Second Temple. And then the last thing I want to talk about, and we'll really get to this when we talk about Torah in more detail, not next week, but in the future, is the year 440 before the Common Era, BCE. 440 is important because that's the return of the people from exile. We actually heard that story upstairs tonight in the Mass. They returned from exile, and there's this marvelous story in Ezra where they finally rebuild the temple. Now you got to remember, the temple in the city of Jerusalem had been wiped out, leveled by the Babylonians. They come back, it's still leveled. They finally rebuild the temple. And then there's this marvelous story that Ezra is going through the temple, and that's been just rebuilt. And he finds the quoted book of the law. And he gets up in front of the people of Judah and he reads the book of the law to them. And they kind of renew their commitment to the law. So think about this. He finds the books, according to the story, and reads the books in the temple that's been rebuilt. Where were the books? The implication is they were always there all along. Well, my guess is, and this is me, is that what he did was construct, because he was a scribe, he constructed what we call the Hebrew Scriptures, at least the Torah, and read that to the people so they could learn the history that would hold them together. So 440 to 400 is a really, really important period. That temple that was built by the people in the 400s lasted until 40 BC. No, I'm sorry, 40 BCE. It is 40. And then it was substantially rebuilt by King Herod, who was a convert. And that's the temple that we get to when we talk about Jesus, that temple standing there. And there's one story in Luke where the disciples are walking by the temple and they say, look at these great stones. And Jesus says, in your lifetime, there will not be left here standing one stone upon another. And that, of course, is the story of the destruction of Jerusalem. Now that's important for tonight because the destruction of Jerusalem is the turning point for the New Testament. Just like the destruction of Jerusalem and the return from exile is the turning point in the Hebrew Scriptures. Why? Because it was, first and foremost, a traumatic event. Secondly, because it also marked the end of the apostolic witnesses of the resurrection. So what do you need at that point? Then, the same thing you needed before. You need written stories. And the written stories of Jesus we call the Gospels. So at some point when we get to talking about the Gospels, we'll talk about why we have only 4 of them, when there probably were hundreds of them, and we know of at least 30 of them. You've heard of them, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel according to Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Peter. I mean, there's a list. The one intact is the Gospel of Thomas. But tonight I want to talk about just the 4 Gospels and how we got them. And so a word about these 2 charts. I did not create these charts. These charts were created by a Roman Catholic by the name of Felix Just. Felix is a student of Father Brown. Father Brown's Raymond Brown. Father Brown is well, he's dead now, but he was the expert on the Gospel according to John. So this is a really good scholarship. I could quibble with all kinds of things, but I won't. If you look at the comparative overview charts, that's the long one. You can use this from now on. The comparative overview charts kind of ask a lot of questions like who traditionally attributed, who's the attributed author, who was the implied author, to whom was it written, that's the audience, that's the context stuff, where was it written from, when, etc. So it's kind of a broader overview. On the back, the four Gospels, some comparative overview charts, actually takes sections and tries to put them in some kind of order. So they sort of take the life of Jesus according to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and they try to fit in John so you can see kind of what connects to what. Literally connects to what, not necessarily historically. And then what I am going to give you when we get to the Gospels is a bear of a document. It'll be about 12 pages long, and it will take every story of the Gospels, every one, and it will give you the parallels. Now, I won't give you the text because that would be 50 pages, but it will give you the parallels of each of the passages. I think it's 12 pages, and it's sort of this size print with, and the only reason I would give it to you and think it was useful to you is that sometimes if you may, especially after a Sunday morning, you hear a story one way from one of the Gospels, and then you go home, you might want to look at the way it shows up in the other 2 or 3. So it's really for your future use, not for anything at the moment.
All right, going in the time frames you're referring to about putting these out. All right, they finished writing the Bible about like 300 or something along those lines. They added the last books.
150
150.
of the Common Era.
150, not 3 something. They didn't add them. All right, now what are they putting on? Because I know we had covered like the Bible started booming around the time like we had bookbinding. In those days, the original ones, like how do you get a whole gospel? Like you can't have it on like a piece of animal skin.
Many years. Hundreds of years. They're scrolls, which are made of animal felt, yeah. If you go to, some of us saw it in Jerusalem, you can actually, when they have whole scrolls displayed. So they're scrolls. If you go to the synagogue, see a real Torah, copies of the Torah.
So it's a scroll, a giant scroll.
Some of them. Later on, there are these things called targums, T-A-R-G-U-M-S, which are books. But they're also made of the same material, so the books are massive, because it's thick. We don't get the printed paper stuff until about the time of Martin Luther.
And people have to write each one.
All handwritten. Everyone is handwritten, and that was the stuff that we talked about. I guess.
What year are we printing now? This was like 18 industrial age?
Oh no, 1490, 1500.
Oh yeah, it had an ink press.
So you don't get a whole Bible, the whole book of the Bible. The very first copy of the whole book of the Bible is the printing of Luther's Bible. I think it's 1530.
Okay, because people are getting their hands on, like, you'd have a gospel or something, you get a scroll of John or something,
right.
You'd have a...
So just imagine worship with no books, no screens, no bouncing balls. So what they did was, what did they do when they got together? They talked, they sang, they prayed, they broke bread, and they told stories of Jesus.
Yeah.
And then later on, they included in it, and we have evidence of this by about 120 of the Common Era. We have evidence that they were reading, quote, the writings of Paul, what we call second readings today. And then, it was much later, when it's actually Jerome, who we celebrate this week, who translated the Greek and Hebrew scriptures into Latin, the Vulgate. And for Christians, the principal Old Testament collection was the Greek translation called the Septuagint.
So United States gets everything kind of like that, because we came here in the 1500s, it was coming out. So as 16 and 1700s rolling around, we have the stuff like.
And not only that,
have the book.
by the time we get to the formation of the United States, we have lots of printing going on. I mean, it's not just, in the beginning, we're not talking about, you know, everybody able to read, we're not talking about every church having a Bible, we're not, but by the time you get to the, you know, it's 200 years later, you got, I mean, one guy, Benjamin Franklin, gets rich, partly by inventing things, but the other way, by printing things. So there are lots of printers by then.
Yeah.
So
Before we have this kind of formal school with 12 grades, this is also part of education, so you
Yes, read the Bible.
People had a Bible, it was a time of day.
Right.
People learned, so.
And they went to
people
church to
learned
read,
that.
learn to read.
Go to church,
So-
learn to read, okay.
All right, so, let's see. Back to the destruction of Jerusalem. Because the destruction of Jerusalem is really, really important. And we know that that happened in 70 AD. So in 70, or, you didn't correct me, CE, Jerusalem is leveled. And prior to this date, and this is really, really important, and we forget it all the time, there were no Christians who were Christians only. Christianity prior to this date is a sect of Judaism. It is not its own religion. It is not separate. In fact, if you read the book of Acts, you'll see that Paul goes back to the temple. You'll see that if you read the story of the first Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, at the end of that whole story, you know, you get the tongues of fire and all that. What do? They go to the temple every day. So Christians, are the people we call Christians, are going to the temple. Now, here's the problem that they have. Number one, they're still a Jewish sect, but they have Gentiles in the community. Not just Gentiles. That's nothing new there, because there were people who, and again, if you read the book of Acts, all that list of names, Parthians, Medes, Elamites, that whole crew, the reason you get that list is all of those people are Jews. They're not, you know, they're not pagans, they're Jews. But they're converts. So there's, in 70 AD, the Christian, what we call the Christian church, is a sect in Judaism made up of Jews who became Christians. I'm calling them Christians, but that, you know, they could have become Sadducees, they could have become Pharisees, they could have become the people in the desert, Essenes, but they became Christians. Then you have Gentiles who became Jews, who became Christians. So what did they do? They were, let's take you know, Joe the Elamite. Joe the Elamite, in order to become a Jew, gets circumcised and obeys all the Jewish ritual law, and he then joins this branch of Judaism. But then you have the Paul problem, which is Paul says, no, this step is unnecessary. In fact, this step is not the gospel, because this step says you got to do something to get to God. Paul teaches a whole bunch of people who are Gentiles that they can become part of Judaism in the sect called Christian by being baptized. And so imagine for yourself these two people. What do you think these folks here think of these folks? They're at best second-class citizens. At worst, they're heretics. They've messed up the bloodline. They've done everything wrong because they're not obeying the law. So the Christian church, the Christian community, has a fight, and it rages through the book of Acts. When we read Galatians, we read a little bit of Galatians, that's what the fight's about, because these people are saying we're Jews too.
They're not saying they're Christian.
No, they're saying they're Jews. They're equal to these people. They're equal to these people. It might be helpful here to just step back for a minute and take you a little bit back into the New Testament, into the Gospels, and remind you of something you read all the time and maybe not get. So today you know that there are there's different sects of Judaism. There's Hasidic Jews, and there's Lubavitcher Jews, and there are Jews of the Reform movement, and there are Reconstructionists. There's all kind of different Jews. So you don't have any trouble believing that Jews can be it can be a sectarian. It's not monolithic, it's sectarian.
What would you call a person who, I mean, I've seen these before on the internet that have like both Christian and Jewish, like the sacraments, like maintained,
You
like
call
the
them,
original,
you
right up
call
the
them,
whole thing,
don't look up that on the internet. These are people who are a problem for Jews and Christians. We'll talk about, that's a good question, we'll talk about that some other time. So, in those days it was true too. So what are the sects at the time of this? Well, there are, I'll take the one that's, you don't even, a lot of people don't know about, and that's a group called the Essenes. These are an ascetic, celibate, they dwell in the wilderness. They're so fed up with all the accommodations that Jewish leaders in this time period, have made with the Romans, that they say, the only way the Messiah is coming back and we get this act back together is if a whole bunch of us go out and live absolutely ascetic lives and be separate from everybody else. We condemn every other sect, and we're going to be out on our own. This is a dead-end group because they don't have sex, they don't procreate. The only way they can get new people is by people coming out in the desert. They're probably the place where John the Baptist comes from. And they're the source, because they were out in the wilderness, remember, of the Dead Sea Scrolls. We got lots of stuff from them. They weren't even known until 1949, and now we got treasure troves of them. You can go and see the caves they lived in if you go to, it's between Jerusalem and the Dead Sea. Really amazing place, hot as blazes, but they did not survive the attack, the destruction of Jerusalem. They got wiped out. Another sect called the Sadducees. You know the Sadducees, Pharisees and the Sadducees, they're all over especially in Matthew's Gospel, which we'll be reading starting in December. The Sadducees are those people, their Bible is only the Torah, not the prophets. They don't believe in a resurrection or any kind of afterlife. They only believe in worship in the temple. This is where the priests are. So they are very protective of the temple. They are very conservative in the sense that they have a small scripture. They look down their noses at the Pharisees, who were allies politically, but not theologically. And their whole center is the temple. Well, when there is no temple, when the temple gets wiped out, that sect of Judaism is gone. Then there are the Pharisees. And the Pharisees, who get a really bad rap in the New Testament, are the good guys most of the time. These are the people who have figured out that you need a portable religion. The temple is important to them, but it's not the most important thing. The scriptures are the most important thing. And study is the most important thing. And synagogues are the most important thing. Because that's where you go to study. They hold the scriptures in their hands. They teach the scriptures. They understand that the Bible for them is the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. In other words, the Old Testament for us.
Are those the ones that would be in the temple, and they would be
They would
talking
be in the temple to teach.
Right. And
So the story of the boy Jesus in the temple,
Yeah, right.
and it says he's with the priests and the scribes. He's with the Pharisees. He's doing what Pharisees do, and Pharisees are all over Judaism. They're not just in Jerusalem. They're everywhere. They get together. They go to Jerusalem once a year for Passover, if they can, and they mainly speak Greek. And they read their scriptures. They read the Greek translation of the scriptures. We talked about it, the Septuagint. Now, when this battle is over, and the Sadducees are gone, and the Essenes are gone, there are two sects left. One of them are the Pharisees. All Jews in the world today are Pharisees. They're descended from the Pharisees. They revere the Pharisees. Rabbis come from the Pharisees. And then there's this other sect called Christians. And they vie for about 60 years, from 70 to 130, when the Romans really wipe out everybody. They vie for being the predominant Jewish sect. So all the stuff in the New Testament, all of it, there is no exception to what I'm going to say. All of the stuff in the New Testament, and all of the so-called anti-Jewish language, and all of the anti-Pharisee language, is the battle that goes on between 70 and 130, between two sects of Judaism as to who's going to be, who are really Jews. And they both treat each other very badly. And ultimately, it's Constantine who resolves this problem. You have to remember why the Christians wanted to be Jews. Not just because they were rooted in this tradition, but because Judaism was the one religion in the Roman Empire that was tolerated. If you were a Jew, you could actually worship as a Jew.
Otherwise, you'd have to worship as the...
Otherwise, you have to burn incense to the emperor. Jews were exempt. So Christians, because for some reason, God only knows, they were, the Romans were not, they're willing to persecute a lot of other people, but not in the beginning, Jews. Because, I mean, they didn't like the politics, but they didn't persecute the religion because somehow they found much to be admired in Judaism, and they weren't revolutionaries for the most part. They played along. The entire New Testament is, I mean, the entire four Gospels are the story, and that's why Jesus gets crucified. He doesn't play along. I mean, who actually deals with Jesus in the end? And the Romans kill him, but it's the Pharisee, it's the Sanhedrin that really does it. And it's not because they're Jew, it's because they do it because Jesus is not playing ball with the powers that be.
Now,
So don't
is
feel
the
bad.
Sanhedrin a Sadducee group?
The Sanhedrin is where the Sadducees and the Pharisees are linked. So some of the Sanhedrin are great rabbis, and some of the Sanhedrin are priests. And in the end, only the rabbis are left. So here's one more little factoid, and that's that up until 130 CE, which is the next big destruction, that's Masada and all of that stuff. In order to be a Jew, well, how does the Bible say you become a Jew? What does the Bible tell you? How are you a Jew according to the Scriptures? It's a great answer, except it's not in the Bible. It is the right answer, by the way. It's not in the Bible.
Okay. Circumcised?
But what do you need to have happen ancestrally?
Your father.
Your father has to be Jewish.
Where is that in the Bible?
Everywhere. Everywhere in the Bible. Literally everywhere. Judaism, being a Hebrew, being an Israelite, being a Jew, is determined by the father. But you all know that today it's determined by the mother. Why? Here's the answer. Between 70 and 130, the Jewish revolt went on. I mean, first they wiped out Jerusalem, and then the Jews didn't give up. They kept revolting. They took Masada, which is the great big fortress. They hold off the Romans for a long time. At one point, they're even printing their own money. They really, and they have to send in huge armies. And ultimately the Romans win. They wipe everybody, and they kill so many men that now the rabbis say, and they're the only ones left, and there are no priests left, the rabbis say, we're not going to exist. So they meet around 100, and they make a couple of decisions. Number one, they decide that from now on, and of course, one of the things that goes with murdering the men is raping the women. So now you got a lot of mongrel kids running around who have Roman or German parents, fathers, and Jewish mothers. What do you do with this? And you have not enough men to propagate the race. So the rabbis gathered outside of Jerusalem in a little town called Jamnia, or Jaffa. Not Jaffa, but well, remember Jamnia. And they agree that the new rules will be, in order to be a Jew, you have to have a Jewish mother. That's how you do it by birth. They also agree that we need something to hold a community together. And so at that meeting, they decide on the canon of the Hebrew Scriptures. This is it. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, all the way through to Zephaniah or Zechariah, or whatever, Malachi. That's it. And now they have a definition of the new community. It's defined by these books, Torah is most important, and it's defined by this, if you will, genealogy. Big crisis. In the meantime, while they're solving that problem, the Christians are becoming, this group, they're becoming less Jews who became Christians, less Gentiles who became Jews who became Christians, and more it's becoming Gentiles who become Christians. And somewhere in there, a great division takes place. But it's not until Constantine that Christianity actually becomes a tolerated religion and understood as a separate religion.
Around, now, one more quick, error. Around what year is it we have actual legitimate churches in every city to where you can take your horse and go to church after because we only had
You mean church buildings?
Yeah, buildings that's
Well, you can find some places where there were church buildings, some, okay, not a lot, about 150. But really the idea of buildings, churches, and very clear understanding, I'm the bishop of Constantinople, you're the bishop of Rome, he's the bishop of Antioch, and we have big churches called cathedrals that look like basilicas because that's where the king lives. They come after Constantine, so after the 300s. They're on the oldest Christian church. It's not even a Christian church anymore, but the oldest cathedral in the world is Santa Sophia or Hagia Sophia in Constantinople.
Around 150 we get the religion off. They start actually putting church on it. There's actual buildings for somebody to go in. And
it would be tough to say that. That's really.
Takes a couple much years.
There would be some, but not many. Because remember, if you build a church, you're a target. Because you are a group that is, you are a bunch of you're heretical because you don't worship the emperor. So you're not only a religious target, you're a political target. But we'll get to that.
So they had it after the Roman Empire before they could start really getting the
No,
church.
actually, the Roman Empire had to say, "Oh, we like you Christians. We want you to be our religion," and then all kinds of good things that.
So we plugged into the Romans, and then we started building. Once we got the government,
then you
we
could
started
go
getting
right.
more. That's
Because now you're the official religion.
Okay.
Go ahead,
I'm sorry. I just wanted to ask a question. When you talk about the Gentiles that became Christian by being baptized, I'm assuming the Jews just went into the Christian sect and were not baptized.
They were.
Oh, they did
Yes,
go through.
baptism was.
That's what
normal.
I wasn't sure whether
But that's a
they
good
just.
question. Jews became Christian by baptism. Gentiles and Jews became Christian. Gentiles who became Jews became Christian by being baptized. That was the symbol of. There were two things that the sect did. They baptized once. Not. Jews were baptizing every month at least, if you're a woman.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And if you touched the dead body, you got baptized. They call it ritual washing. They went to a mikvah, but it's the same thing. Christians said once, and you had this meal. You were baptized, and you had a regular meal on the first day of the week, which was Sunday. Which meant that you might have worked all day, and then when going to church was not, the adult forum, the 11 o'clock mass brunch, and misa. It was you went to somebody's house, much more simply, much more simple. Call the ambulance. It's not, yes, write up a report and call the ambulance. It's not her choice, it's ours.